Next section of visualizations are the charts. Let's bring in some charts in our dashboard and see to what data we can link this. If you click the green button, you can see we can link the charts to either queries or views. Let's start with the queries. On top you see two tables in my dashboard. These are basically the two queries I have prepared for this session. So below each table I will try to show graph representing the same data. So on here on top, this is the interface table query, and here at the right hand side we have our task manager table. Okay, this is not enough. We need some further configuration for the charts. If we go to the settings, we see we need to configure our label, and then one or multiple columns also for the bars. The same thing goes for the second chart, of course. Again, a label and one or multiple parameters for the bars. Okay, regarding the layouts, we select one of the charts. We can choose between absolute and relative charts. We can change the orientation to, for example, a bottom to top chart. We can customize the position of the legend, for example, at the bottom, and we can also configure what needs to be displayed in our tooltips. This chart, let's also position the legend at the bottom so that we have a nice dashboard. The same queries can also be visualized with a pie chart. Let's see how that goes. We'll go to the data section, select the query again, and just link it to the visualization. And we can see that we have similar options here in the settings. So we can link the label to one of the columns and then choose one of the other columns as the value to be displayed. Pie chart can of course only display one parameter at the time. Let's add another one and link that to our second query. And then for the settings, again choose the label and then one of the parameters, and you can see immediately how this affects the visualization. Regarding layout, we can choose between a pie or a donut visualization. And then for the legend, the same thing, we can choose the position, and also for the tooltips we can choose what information needs to be included in there. For bar and line charts, there was also another data source to which we could link, and that's the views. If we do that and link, for example, to one of our views, we can see that we end up with a top 10 chart, which you might remember from a DataMiner reporter. So it's a top 10 of elements which has generated the most alarms. If you look at the settings, so it's similar settings as in DataMiner reporter. So we can change the source from element to service. If you want the top 10 services, for example, with the highest number of alarms. You can choose between number of alarms, so number of events, and the time that an element was in a certain state. You can choose between top and bottom charts, limit the number, so top 10, change top 10 to top 5, for example, and you can apply a time range on which the calculation is done. In layout, you can choose to set a limitation on the number of severities. You can reverse the data, so instead of having the elements here at X-axis, you can have the states here, and then you have the elements here in the legend. You can also stack the bars, and instead of putting putting them side by side. And you have an option to show or hide the legend. Below the chart, you can also add a table with the numbers, and you can add some extra columns for the totals and some extra information. And then we also have our line chart. If we bring that in and see to what data we can link it, we can see that we can link this to parameters and resources. Let's start off with parameters. Take our server. Pick one parameter here, total processor load. We see that we get the trend data for the last 24 hours by default. We select the component and look at what settings we have. So we have the trend span on top. So we can change that to another time span, for example. We have some options here to specify the range that is applied to the y-axis. So by default, it's an auto-scaling like you know from Cube, but you can configure a fixed range here, for example, let's say from 0 to 100%, so the full range of this parameter. You can choose to display the real-time trend data or the average trend data if you trend both ranges. And then for average data, you can choose on which subset you want to have the line. So by default, it's on the average value, but you can also have the line on the minimum or the maximum or on combinations. We'll talk about grouping in a minute when we add a second parameter. In the layout, we also have some options here regarding the multiple parameters. And if you look at the styling and information, we can add a range selector at the bottom. Also something you might remember from Cube. We can specify the line thickness, enable and expand the legend initially, for example. If we link this component to feeds, we can choose to hide parameters that do not have trend data in a specified range. And you can enable or disable the min-max shading on the average data. We can add two types of additional lines. First one is a dynamic line. It's a line on percentile calculation, for example, percentile 95. And then you have some options here to adapt the styling. So again, line thickness and the color. Another type of line is a fixed line, a boundary line, like we call it here. So you can have a line, for example, at 20%. And also for these lines, you can specify the color. To illustrate the grouping of the trend component, I've created a demo here with two parameters from two different elements, and it concerns table parameters. So I've also linked 5 table indices to it. So if you make the combination, we end up with 20 parameters. By default, there is no grouping applied, so the 20 parameters are all displayed in separate charts below each other in a scrolling view. But if we choose to group by parameter, for example, we end up with 2 charts, one per parameter. So we have a first one here for the parameter CPU, where we iterate over the elements and the indices, and then a second one for the second parameter. Same thing goes for grouping by elements, but then of course we have a chart per element and we iterate over the parameters and the indices. If we group on table index, we end up with 5 different charts, and each chart shows the 2 parameters from the 2 elements. Finally, we can also group everything together in one big chart. Let's go back to grouping by elements to illustrate the layout options concerning grouping. So here we have 2 charts in the scroll view, but we can choose also to put multiple charts next to each other with different columns, or also below each other when specifying multiple rows. By default, each chart is limited to 16 lines, but you can change that, of course. And the chart limit behavior is by default disable parameters in the legend. So that means that if you would load more than 16 parameters here in this case, that only the first 16 will be loaded, and that you can then toggle these on and off in the legend. So for example, if we group everything together here, we end up with more than 16 parameters, so 20 parameters. And we see here, if we don't hover over that, 4 items are disabled. And if we hover over, we can enable one by one as extra items. The limit is there to have to limit the load, of course, the initial load of these trend charts. We also have a different behavior that's creating additional charts. So if we apply that, we end up with 16 parameters in the first chart, and then a second chart with the 4 remaining items. And that's it for the grouping options on the trend chart.